Okay.
All right. We got to Salt Lake City. It was about, I guess it was on about a Wednesday. Anyhow, I stopped at a gas station and I said, well, we burn up. Before I left home, I bought 2 cases of oil. No, 1 case of oil, but it was 24 quarts back then instead of 12 or whatever you might burn now. And then it was, I had bought me 2 spare tires, and they wasn't neither one of them real good, but you ain't looking at the show. What are you doing?
Knock it off.
Anyway, when we got there, we stopped at a station, and I said, have you got an old tire or something around here that I could use for a spare tire? And he looked and I looked, and we both saw one about the same time. And he had this one that had a lot of good rubber on it, but it had a hole in the face, right in the middle of that rubber, about big as your thumb. And he looked at that again, and I looked at it, and I said, well, can't you do something about that hole? Can't you put a blowout shoe over it or something? And he thought about it a second or two, and he said, well, yeah, I think so. And so he did. He put a blowout shoe over it, and I suppose he must have had a tube he put in there. And I don't remember. He charged me for a tube, but anyway, he charged me $2.50 and put it on the car, and put it right behind the driver, because that was me. I done all the driving, but I put the spare that he gave me right behind me on the ground, and I'll cut that part short and just tell you that I drove it all the way back home, didn't have no flats. But on the way out, I took the southern route, came across a lot of states, Arkansas, Tennessee, and a few others, and sure enough, when I turned the engine off and turned it back on, it had run long enough to, the battery charged up and it started again. So I was all right there. But then I got to Kansas, and North Carolina was a tree state back then. It had a lot of trees, and you could hunt deer just by walking out there in the woods. Anyway, and you could put a dog out there, and he would chase the deer, and you could catch him that way. But anyway, when I got to Kansas, I looked out across there, and I must have felt like Brigham Young when he first got to Salt Lake. He stepped out on the ground, I guess, or somewhere, and he looked out across Salt Lake, and he said, "This is the place." And there was a church that was with him. They all said, "Surely you're kidding. There was not a tree in sight." Nothing but the big old wide space. And if you look far enough, you probably could see the Great Salt Lake. Anyway, they took us in their car the next day, being probably about Thursday. Could have been Friday, but I think it was Thursday anyway. We had gone down and made arrangements to go through the temple. Mary and I, and Mother couldn't go in the temple right then because her husband wasn't a member. And that's just the way it was back then. But we made arrangements to go through the temple, and they wanted to go through with us, but they both had to work, so they didn't see no way they could make it. But we felt, sitting on the back row of the temple waiting, it seemed like it was a very, very special feeling. You won't never realize it until you've been there. But it was, and by the way, the Salt Lake Temple was one of the only ones that still had a live presentation instead of a film and that sort of stuff. They had live people performing the session. But anyway, we went, Mary and I, in the temple. Mother was the babysitter, and we went in the temple and got our endowment. And then they took us up to the ceiling room, and there they brought our two children, Mary Lou and NL. And they were both young, but they were our children, and so they brought them in, and we sit around the ceiling table, and they sealed us together as a family. Well, I figured I wasn't going to be going back through the temple for quite a while, but back then there was only about 5 temples in the whole church, and Salt Lake City was the closest one. So anyhow, St. George was another, and Manti was one, but you may not know much about them. Anyway, we went through the temple, and then afterwards we decided to go through again, because it would be a while before we'd come back and go again. And so we just thought we ought to learn all we could. So we went through the second time. And then we called Brother Madsen out there at Murray, Utah, and he just came right down and took us out of the motel and took us out to his house. And he wouldn't let us spend any time in that motel. So that was fine, because we didn't have the money. We hadn't spent no money the whole trip. We didn't know that you couldn't make a trip like that. I had $100, and my mother had $50. And so we had $150, and we didn't know you couldn't make that trip on $150. So we just jumped in the car and took off. Of course, my mother was the type that she cooked a bunch of fried chicken and different stuff to snack on. And so on our trip, we didn't stop for motels and stuff. We just kept driving. When you get hungry, you stop and snack, whatever you wanted to eat if you had it. And then you're away you go again. And so we did that all the way across the country. We had a big oil company send us a map. I asked them to mark us a route to Salt Lake City. Well, they just opened up the map, and they drug a yellow thing across from Newburgh to Salt Lake City. And they forgot to say how crooked the road was, or how bumpy it was, and all that stuff. But I could have drawn the same map, I think. Anyway, we made that trip, and in Kansas, we had a flat tire. I got 2 spares before I left home, and one of them was a little smaller than the other one, but the lug fitted the hole, so that was anything. Then when I got into Kansas, and like I say, I looked out across Kansas. This was in April, and I felt like Brigham Young felt when he first got to the "This is a place" monument. I looked out across there and no trees nowhere. And North Carolina was full of trees when I left there. But anyhow, I had my first flat tire in Kansas. And I just changed the tire, put on another tire, and I didn't bother to worry about getting it fixed, and I just throwed it in there and took off. And I kept driving, and I got down to the Continental Divide, and when we got to the Continental Divide, I don't know if you're familiar with that. That's supposed to tell you that the water that's on one side goes back to the Atlantic Ocean, and on the other side it goes to the Pacific Ocean, which may or may not all be exactly true. But anyway, we got to the Continental Divide, and let me tell you, it was cold up there. They had icicles that was big around as your body, big as it is now, and 10 feet tall on both sides of the road. And the snow during the winter, they had to keep plowing it out so vehicles could keep getting through. And it looked like it weren't wide enough for 2 vehicles, but it must have been, because we got through there all right. Anyhow, we kept driving, and we got down into Price, Utah. That's southern Utah. Some of you know where it's at, some don't. Anyhow, they mined coal in that country. And so anyway, we got in the Price area and had another flat tire. And so I just put the other spare tire on and put the other one in the trunk and just took off and kept going. I didn't take time to get none of them fixed. I figured when I got that far with 2 tires, surely we would make it to Salt Lake before we had to worry about a tire. And sure enough, we did. Well, when we made arrangements to get our patriarchal blessing, we were fortunate enough to get a hold to the head patriarch of the church, and his name was Eldred G. Smith. In case most of you don't know him and know about it, his brother, his great-grandfather was Hiram Smith's brother. And, well, he was Hiram Smith's son, grandson, great-grandson. Anyway, Hiram Smith, of course, was Joseph Smith's brother. And they were both shot in Carthage jail, which you may or may not be aware. But anyway, that's so much for the history there. And then after that, we made arrangements to go to the temple. We made arrangements to get our patriarchal blessings, and we got those. And then they weren't planning to go through the temple with us because they both had to work. But as we were sitting on the back row waiting to go in the temple, they showed up. Of course, tears in their eyes, and there was tears in our eyes too. We were so glad to have them go through with us. Anyhow, they had gotten off work somehow and were there, so we went through the temple. And like I said, we went through twice because we didn't know when we'd get back, and there was only 5 temples in the whole church, and Salt Lake City was the closest one. So anyway, we I called Brother Matson, and he came right down and got us out of there. Hey, you two. Hey, you got to be quiet. He came right down and got us out of the motel and took us back to his home. And so we spent the rest of the time there. And the next day, we you guys are distracting. You have to be quiet. Okay. Anyway, the next day he took us in his car, Mother and our 2 children and me and Mary, and we drove all over that valley looking at the valuables, church sites. This Is Your Place monument was one of them. And then we went over to Welfare Square. That's where the Bishop's storehouse is. And they got rail cars lined up out there with wheat in them. And they got a tall dryer stacked up there in the air where they stored it. Anyway, that was quite an important site. Then we went to a place called the Bingham Copper Mine. That's the largest open pit copper mine in the world. And they probably have more gold coming out of that mine than they do copper. But copper's the main thing that they mine there, and they had an observation deck, and it's like I say, it was the largest open pit copper mine in the world, and they hauled that copper from the bottom of the thing out to the top by going around and around and around and around until they finally got out the top. And then they would haul it around the mountain to a smelter where they changed it to whatever it was they were trying to do. I guess it was copper. And right across from that was the Great Salt Lake. And that was quite an experience. We walked out on that thing until we couldn't stand up in the water because it was so salty. We would be walking, and all of a sudden we wasn't standing on the water. We were standing in about as much water under us as it was on top. But anyhow, that was quite an experience. And so we came out of there and went back to some of the other sites, and there was some more, but I won't tell you all of them right now. That's the main ones. And then we, somewhere either in Saturday, I think it was Saturday, we decided that we had to get up and leave and go back home. And we decided to go straight across the mountain this time through Denver, Colorado. And that was called the northern route because we came up on the southern route. Anyhow, we got in our car, and when we got ready to leave, Brother Madsen gave me his credit card, and he told me if I needed it to use it. And I took off, and we drove straight across. We came straight home. We did not have any flat tire on the way home. We got home just in time for I to go back to work, and I was right where I started in the beginning, and that was broke. I had enough money to send him his credit card, and I had used it a couple of times, so I sent him the money that I owed him and his credit card, and then I paid my tithing. And after I paid my tithing, again, like I say, I was broke. But there was a miracle that happened there. When we decided to go on our temple trip, we had a choice, and that was to buy the house we were living in or else go to the temple. And we'd had to pay a down payment to buy the house, and then we wouldn't have been able to go to the temple. So we prayed about it and decided going to the temple was the most important thing. So that's why we went to the temple. And then we got back home, we talked to the man that was going to sell us the house. And when we told him what happened, he said, well, I'll go ahead and sell you the house anyway with no down payment. Now, if you got time for more, I got a little more.
Well, didn't your car quit the minute it got in the driveway?
It did.
Again?
I drove that car back in the driveway and backed it in right where I'd left with it. And I had the gas truck to drive back and forth to work, so I didn't worry about the car. But it sat there, and it never started again. Never. And that was the story of the car. But when I talked to this guy, he went ahead and sold me the house with no down payment. And so we were able to buy the house.
And how much did you pay for this house?
$3,500. It was a little 2-bedroom house, 1 bath, and first time we saw it, it had chickens running around inside. They were baby chickens, but they were still chickens. But they got that all cleaned up.
Well, I'm gonna go ahead and stop it because it's
Okay.